Welcome to Organized Chaos, the podcast dedicated to helping seven-figure companies grow to nine-figure ones by turning HR into rocket fuel for their growth. I'm your host, Nahat Kirwala, and I've been helping companies do just that for more than a decade. In each episode, I'll dive into HR topics that have a significant impact on your company's growth and leave you with actionable advice that will help your business reach its full potential. Let's dive right in and start organizing all that HR chaos. Hello and welcome to episode 5. In today's episode, I'd like to address a topic that has been capturing headlines and stirring a lot of debate in the world of work since the pandemic days up until now. And I'm talking specifically about this whole discussion between remote work, hybrid, and in-office, this tug of war that's been going on between companies and employees. And I sort of want to approach this from a different angle. I don't think the discussion should be around which one is better than the other, but rather which one is right for your company. The reason I say that is because, in my very humble opinion, most companies I've worked with, and a lot of the ones making the news with the headlines, have done a really horrible job in managing this debate between remote and in-office work. My goal in this episode is really to help you decide between remote, hybrid, and in-office. Really make a decision on which one is best for your company and why. I also want to highlight the pros and cons of each model because each one of them has them, and really talk a bit about the circumstances that you will need to have as a company in order to adopt one of these models over the other more successfully. Whichever model you choose, the key here is that you need to design the way you work in an organization based on the model you go with. What we've seen really throughout these past 4 to 5 years is companies have pretty much flip-flopped between remote to hybrid, and now there's these return to office mandates and so forth. And the biggest problem that's happened with remote, from my perspective, is that we have tried to take the in-office environment and just transplant it as is to the remote workplace via Zoom. That is the biggest challenge here. Each working model has very distinct differences in terms of how to best operate it to make sure you're optimizing for it. The thing is that the model you choose has a major impact on how work is done at your company. So my take on this is that you need to design your ways of working based on what your company needs and then decide which work model best fits those needs. If you look at some companies like Starbucks, Meta, Disney, and Amazon, who've recently rolled back their remote work policies, they've asked employees to come back to the office or transition to a hybrid work schedule. These companies, for those of you who don't know, they issued remote work policies a while back, and they had communicated to employees that they will let them work remotely forever, and then made a U-turn last year. I have a lot of opinions about that, but those types of decisions show that even these large companies with all these resources still haven't figured it out when it comes to remote versus hybrid versus in-office. No one's figured it out 100%, but my take is that you don't need to figure each one of these out, because when you think of what the best work style is for your organization and how you've been set up, you need to choose the model that best complements that. So before we dive into each model, I want to share with you some recent statistics that will help you understand the current landscape and the distribution of remote, hybrid, and in-office working environments. And there's a link to these statistics in the show notes. 1 in 5 workers is working 100% remotely right now. 98% of the workforce wants to work remote at least some of the time due to the flexibility. In terms of companies, 16% of companies in the United States operate fully remotely right now. The top 5 industries for remote workers right now are tech, accounting and finance, marketing, healthcare, and project management. Also, 38% of advanced degree holders, meaning people who have a postgraduate degree and above, and 35% of bachelor's degree holders work some or all of their hours remotely right now. The distribution between fully remote and hybrid among this population is almost a 50-50 split. On the other hand, more than 90% of non college graduates do not do any telework right now. If we take a step back and just look at what these numbers mean, what it means is that remote work is still not highly prevalent as one would think. It's been rolling back somewhat to its pre pandemic days. But on the other hand, you have 98% of the workforce that wants to do some kind of remote work. Also, the number of companies that are fully remote is still 16%. And if I'm not mistaken, it was around 10 to 12% pre-pandemic. So not a big change, but it's still an increase nonetheless. The industries, I think it makes a lot of sense. Highly educated white collar workers are and knowledge-based workers are the ones that typically are working mostly remotely right now because the jobs allow them to do so. Some that were kind of interesting to me is healthcare as being one of the top 5 industries for remote work. And we've all seen the telehealth increase over the past couple of years, but that was pretty surprising for me to see. But again, when you look at the distribution of the workforce, 38% of advanced degree holders and 35% of bachelor's degree holders are working some of their hours remotely. So that's still a good chunk of the population, and it's probably going to be increasing over time since hybrid seems to be the model that is growing the fastest. Now, when you look at the stat which says 90% of non-college graduates do not do any telework, that is a function of the roles they're in. A lot of those jobs, once you dive into some of these stats, are jobs that require physical presence. If you're a barista at Starbucks, there is no remote work option for you. If you're a warehouse worker at Amazon, there is no remote work for you. Now, let's start talking about these working models, these 3: remote, hybrid, and in office. And I'll start with remote work. Remote work comes in many different forms. So you can have employees who are living in the same area but not coming to an office. This has become pretty common with companies that were traditionally in office, but once the pandemic came along, they transitioned to remote and stayed remote. So what you ended up having is that a majority of the employee population was actually local. And as the company continued to grow, more people from different locations started joining the company remotely. But the biggest employee population is typically still local in one area. I worked at one company, Glorious Gaming, that had that same situation where the company was traditionally Dallas-based, all employees were there. But then when the pandemic hit and the transition happened to remote, the only non-remote positions were the warehouse roles. The other version is where employees work remotely and they are spread out and sprinkled in different locations and time zones. Typically speaking, when we're saying remote work, there is no physical office, there is no physical space, and employees work fully remotely 100% of the time. So there are several pros to remote work. From an HR standpoint, the biggest advantage here is that you gain access to the global talent market. It's really that simple. Any person in the world who has the skill set to do the job that you want them to do is a potential candidate. Another advantage of remote work is that it provides employees with flexibility. And flexibility comes in different shapes and forms. It might be flexibility in terms of the working hours, in terms of how they do the work, because remote work really shines when there is a significant amount of asynchronous work that can be done without the need to collaborate as much as other types of roles or models. So the flexibility that employees gain is pretty advantageous, and it's probably the thing that has resonated the most with employees who have worked remotely. Another advantage here is that it's cheaper for a company to operate without any physical offices. The overhead required to set up an office, especially if you are in a high cost area, could be prohibitive to doing business to some smaller companies. And not all small companies and not all startups have venture capital funding where they can throw money at these things and not care about it for a while. Most startups and most growing companies are bootstrapping. And one of the final things is remote work just eliminates the commuting, right, for employees. So it saves time, it saves money for employees, gas, wear and tear, tollways, and so forth. And it also grants the company indirectly more working hours. There's a lot of studies, especially that happened during the pandemic days and even post pandemic, which shows that people who work remotely tend to put in more hours throughout the day. I'm not saying that is a great thing, but that is a result of working remotely. When you can roll out of bed and right onto your chair and just start working, the time available to you to get stuff done just increases. If you have that final report you want to get out the door, there's this final email you want to look at, it's much easier to do when you're sitting at home and not having to go through traffic for a couple hours a day. Now, remote work also has its downsides, just like all the other working models we're going to talk about. For starters, it is very difficult to build and maintain a cohesive culture in a remote working environment. It is super challenging. 53% of remote workers say it's harder to feel connected to their coworkers. And this stat did not surprise me one bit. As someone who's worked remotely for a big chunk of my career between hybrid and remote, I can personally attest to this. It is super difficult because when employees are not in a common space, when they are not interacting with each other personally day after day, when they're not interacting with each other outside of work, it takes a lot longer for that cohesion to build. And that gelling of the team needs to be more purposeful and deliberate. If you're in an office and you want to go grab lunch, you're probably going to run into multiple of your teammates having lunch there. You're going to sit down, you're going to chit chat, you're going to have some non-work or work-related conversations, but the communication is going to bring the team closer together. Teams that are remote, there needs to be a lot of effort and investment into building the culture, being more purposeful. And even if fully remote, it's always beneficial to bring the team together physically because, as human beings, we are social creatures and we need that interaction to build trust and to build camaraderie and to help the team connect well together. Another disadvantage is something I alluded to earlier. It's pretty challenging to separate work time from personal time when you're working remote because everything's sort of happening in the same place. You do not have that physical barrier, that disconnection. It has to be very deliberate. And remote work has been linked to a higher chance of burnout. People tend to burn themselves out more or have a higher probability of doing so because they're always switched on, they're always working. It just takes a toll on you. Another disadvantage is that you might have situations where employees do not have the ideal work setups for them to get their job done properly, unless the company's paying for it. A lot of companies today who operate remotely, they have a work from home stipend. And the reason that stipend exists is not because they are all Mother Teresa's and they want to give money away. It is because that money is supposed to go towards the technology and equipment that you need to have in your home in order to be effective and productive on the job. Some companies, even remotely, they offer their employees co-working space reimbursements and stuff of that sort. It's always much cheaper than renting out an office space, but at the same time, that is available because employees, for the most part, don't have the same type of work setups that are available in physical office spaces. So that is also one of the downsides. The final one is remote work from an HR standpoint can be a compliance nightmare, especially if you're a company that has multi state employees, and international employees. For those of you who work in the United States, you know that every state to some extent sometimes feels like its own different country, especially when you start looking at states like New York, Washington, California. There's a lot of compliance work that needs to be done to ensure that you are hiring people in a compliant way and not get yourself into hot water with the government. Internationally, that throws another curveball at you. A lot of employer of record companies have popped up from the pandemic days up until today. Companies like Remote, Deal are some of the two popular ones, Oyster HR. These companies, what they help you do is that for a monthly fee, they will register the employee under their local entity in the country that you're operating in. Let's say you're a US based company and decide you want to hire someone in the UK. Those EOR companies will have local companies registered to their name, and they will take on all the compliance work and all the paperwork and everything that's needed to be able to hire someone legally and compliantly in a different country. And they will just charge you a fee, and they will collect the payroll money from you, and they will take care of all the disbursements and so forth. But it's still a compliance nightmare and not easy to navigate, especially if you're a very small company. So, which types of companies is remote work ideal for? Generally, from what I've seen and what I've seen work, is that companies that thrive remotely are those who have work that does not require people to be present together at all points in time. Of course, you can say that's the obvious answer, right? But what do I mean by this? Proximity of employees to each other is important when you're dealing with a lot of unstructured type of work, things like R&D, things like product design, where there's a lot of iteration, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in group and sometimes to make sure that you're getting things right. Whereas companies who are in industries where there's a lot of work that can be accomplished on an individual contributor basis while making sure that everyone is on the same page with some excellent synchronization and alignment, those companies thrive in a remote working environment. And the reason that happens is because you become very deliberate about what you need to align on and what you need to completely delegate to other teams and to people and give them really the free rein to run with things as long as they hit the results you're looking for. So it's less about how they do something, it's about really the end result of things. For it to work properly, it requires a certain level of asynchronous work, especially if there are people in very different time zones in the organization. The final point is that companies that have a predominantly knowledge-based workforce, they have all the requirements of making sure that remote work can work for them, as long as they set up their work operations accordingly. Now let's move on to hybrid work. Hybrid work has been really touted as the work model of the future. In concept, a hybrid model allows employees to do individual contributor work remotely and leverage the office to do collaborative work that is more efficient and impactful in person. Hybrid companies can also have roles that are fully remote or in office. And these decisions are generally made really on a job by job basis. But for the most part, most hybrid companies, they tend to have all employees do this partial in office presence, except there are some roles which really just don't need it and they're fully individual contributor roles. Things that I can think of are like call center agents and so forth, where you really don't need that in person collaboration. For the most part, you just need synchronization calls here and there, a lot of documentation to be up to date on. But for the most part, it is an individual contributor job. Many companies also claim that they adopt a hybrid approach because it just leads to better creativity and innovation as a result of the in-person interaction. So Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, came out and said, I think a few weeks ago, was that remote work was primarily responsible for Google's lack of innovation and creativity over the past couple of years. The research data on that is really mixed. There are some studies that validate this, whereas others that completely refute it. So I think we need more data before we can tell for sure if hybrid work actually leads to more creativity or innovation or not. Now, having said that, there are several pros to a hybrid working environment. First and foremost, it caters to a wide range of employee preferences. If you're someone who likes to come to the office every day, you can do that. If you want to work remotely, you can do that. And if you want to have a blend of the two, there's also something for you here. That is a good model to have if you are going to be a hybrid work environment that offers all of these models. So that's one of the big advantages. If you're an organization that wants to mandate everyone come into the office on certain days versus not, then of course this still remains an advantage because you offer some kind of remote work for those people who want it. But at the same time, you are kind of limiting maybe the talent pool you have access to. Another good thing, which is the complete opposite of what we talked about in remote work, is that company culture can be more deliberate because almost all of the employees work at the office some of the time. So the proximity really helps the team gel and get to know each other, which in part really assists in building a culture and having a more homogeneous team. Another advantage is employee oversight is easier and more familiar to managers due to the proximity. Now, some of the cons of hybrid work models. One of the biggest disadvantages that I've seen in a lot of literature, as well as some news headlines and so forth, is that employees are not getting the same work experience. It is not the same employee experience to them when, especially if you have people who are only remote versus others who are coming into the office on some days. There have really been several reports of also managers stating that employees who show up to the office have better chances of getting promoted than their remote work counterparts. Those statements alone by managers really prove this point that you can suffer if you're someone who doesn't come into the office at all versus others who do. So when you're not giving the same experience, the model's broken. Whenever a company is employing a hybrid work model, you need to take this into account and make sure that no one is being penalized for being in a work situation that is different than their peer. And managers need to be trained on how to manage this as well. One of the second disadvantages of hybrid work is that without solid communication and coordination between team members, office days end up being the same as remote working days. If you show up to the office only to get on Zoom calls with your colleagues, then this whole thing is a big fail. No point in having offices, then the whole model needs to be rethought. The whole point of hybrid work is that in-office days are highly collaborative, productive days. They are not Zoom call days. They are not days for doing individual contributor work that you could be doing remotely. So that is a big watch out for people and companies who are trying to employ a hybrid model. Similar to that, it is very challenging to coordinate in-office work time between all staff, unless the company has passed down clear policies that govern this. If your company says that Mondays and Thursdays are mandatory office days dedicated for collaborative work and there are no Zoom meetings, then that helps. But at the same time, you need to go a step deeper into this and make sure that the way work is designed, it should ensure that on those office days, employees are only doing work that can only be done in office as defined by the company. So which types of companies is hybrid work really ideal for? Companies or teams with a high level of unstructured work that requires a lot of collaboration between different people can benefit from hybrid working models. Things like product design and development, R&D, and other similar roles, those can benefit from hybrid working environments because there is a great degree of work that is done in collaboration with others, and there isn't always a clear timeline of when that work ends. If you're designing a new product or researching, doing some R&D work, you don't know that you're going to start and end the collaborative work or you're going to come out with a design by spending 2 days in the office together. So companies that have that kind of model or that kind of operation can benefit from hybrid work. Also, companies that have a large employee population within a commutable distance, those types of companies can benefit from hybrid because the barrier to going hybrid is very low. Now, the cost might be prohibitive to them, but you can leverage things like co working spaces and you can have more frequent get togethers that are more purposeful as opposed to being fully remote. This is quite common among companies that were in office before COVID and moved to fully remote. So, a big portion of their employee population is within a short distance. Now, finally, let's wrap things up with in office work. The majority of companies still use in office working models. And you see this mostly with companies who have well established office premises that they've spent millions of dollars on. I'm sure you've all seen in the news companies like Apple, Meta, Google, and Amazon have invested millions of dollars in their office real estate. So, by them asking employees to come into the office, first off, it's no surprise at all because they've made such large investments in creating these optimal office spaces that they want to make sure they're using these assets. I mean, companies that have built their entire operations around physical presence in the office, those will have to undergo some very disruptive changes if they want to move into hybrid or remote. And a lot of times, making that change is very disruptive on the operation that some larger companies just decide that it's not worth it and just bring everyone back into the office. And that's really why a lot of this is happening. So let's jump into the advantages of office work. To start, it offers you a fixed physical space that has all the tools and equipment you need to work. It is an optimized workspace. It has everything you need. So, an office space just ensures that all employees have access to these same type of equipment, hardware, tools, everything they need to get the job done. Another advantage is that, in office work, it just creates a physical boundary between your work life and your personal life. Having that separation is kind of healthy and it helps minimize the risk of burnout. Also, the proximity to employees just makes it easier to get work done, as opposed to sending someone an email or an invitation to a Zoom call or a Slack message and just waiting for an answer. If you see that person right across the hall or you know where their office is, you just walk over there and ask them for what you're looking for. Company oversight, something we spoke about in hybrid, is also something which is easier for a company to manage. Managers are more comfortable managing performance in a physical office space because of the proximity, because of their ability to see and interact with their team members whenever they need to. And finally, in-office space really helps you build a company culture much faster. Assuming you know what you're doing, of course, it is the easiest model to enable a strong company culture because of the proximity, because of the ability to observe behaviors in real time, makes it a lot easier to manage culture. And it also makes it a lot simpler to identify any issues that are going on. Like all the other models we talked about, in-office also has its drawbacks. First off, the commute itself is a big time suck, especially if you work in areas that are heavily congested. That time could be spent doing more meaningful work. Probably the biggest drawback to in-office work is that it is very rigid and it requires everyone to be in the office within relatively the same working hours for it to function properly. Because if you're not able to work outside of that physical office, you don't have access maybe to the tools, to the equipment, to the systems, and so forth. If someone's not there, they're not there. You can't get any work done. Furthermore, it restricts the company's talent pool really to their immediate geographical area. Or if you want to tap into talent outside of your area, you're going to have to foot the bill for relocation and all the costs that come along with it. So it's a pretty expensive venture. But at the same time, not everyone wants to move to your location. So you are missing out on a lot of talent, and that could put you at a disadvantage versus your competitors, especially if a lot of them are remote or have some hybrid models going on. The alternative is that your company needs to be located in a talent hub for the industry you're in. Otherwise, it becomes really difficult to find the right talent. And as you all know, talent is essential to accelerating your growth and your profitability and so forth. Finally, maintaining office space is expensive. the costs are going up year over year. Even if you don't add any headcount and you still need the same size office space, all the utilities, everything else is just going up year over year. It is an expensive venture. And if you're a company that doesn't really need it, then there is no point. So before we wrap up, let me talk about the types of companies that can benefit from an in-office working model. For starters, I think in office is a good idea for companies that have spent so much money on designing their office spaces to accommodate a certain working style that going away from that is a big loss of capital, but at the same time requires additional large investments to change your working model. If the in office model has been working for your organization, then stick to it, especially if you've optimized your ways of working to it. I think companies moving forward, unless they absolutely have to, and they work in an industry where it is impossible to have remote work, like if you run a restaurant or a hotel chain, yeah, most of the work you're doing is happening on premises, with the exception of a few roles here and there, like customer care, for example, and bookings and so on. You need that in office space. But for companies who do not provide a product or service that is delivered in a physical space, that has to be done in person with the clients, like a hotel, like a dentist and so forth, then considering at least hybrid is a more future-proof approach and just gives you access to more talent and over time allows the company to reduce its total footprint when it comes to office space and just maybe reduce that overall cost altogether. That's all for today's episode. In the next episode, I'm going to deep dive into how you can build a 100% remote company that actually works. I'll also talk about two well-known companies that started as fully remote way before the pandemic and discuss the reasons behind their success. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts. This will help me spread the word about organized chaos and keep the show going. If you have any questions or topics you'd like to suggest for the show, please send me an email to hello@organizedchaos.fyi. For more content and resources, make sure to check out the website at organizedchaos.fyi. See you on the next one.